say, okay, this is normal, or this is a given. So I just want to introduce this thing we call the university, just briefly, as a site of coloniality. And when we talk about coloniality, we are talking about the fact that when colonialism was formally ended, there was the continued existence of colonialism, but not necessarily administratively realizable or visible. So we still have cases of colonialism that still influence our perceptions of gender and sexuality in our understandings, and how the university then, in this regard, exploits female women, or feminine presenting people rather, and queer people. And for more on such work, you can read the likes of Walter Mignolo. My colleague William Jetrompof does work on coloniality. One of my other colleagues, Dr. Sharon Day, also does work on coloniality. There's also work by Sabelo and Lovgacheni that looks at coloniality. So apart from the fact of coloniality, the university, because of the relationship between coloniality and heteronormativity and patriarchy and cisnormativity, we find that the university is also being infiltrated by religious and traditional norms. And in my PhD thesis, I focus on the question of home amongst Joburg-based queer people. And I find that while African culture and Christianity are can be considered two opposing beliefs, they are, however, used in a similar way for homophobia or for misogyny or gender-based harm. But this is despite the fact that colonial African cultures were actually more open to gender and sexual diversity. So the continent of Africa, originally, if to use such a very essentialist understanding, or pre-colonial Africa is not sort of a heterosexual continent. There is evidence across of actually female leadership and also queer relationships that existed. So the African culture is authentically not heterosexual, which is a belief that came with the colonization of Africa. And we can also then see how Christianization also led to sort of the Christianization of African traditional beliefs themselves. We believe that traditionally women occupy such a role. Traditionally, these are heterosexuality is the norm. But if you look up one of the work by some of the work by one of my colleagues, Dr. Haley McIrwin, who looks at the pro-family movement in Africa, you will find evidence of how this is not sort of an original part of African identity. So when we use this logic of coloniality and what Walter Mignolo refers to as the colonial matrix of power, we can see that to be a woman or a man who is feminine in a space such as the university, which is originally structured and systematized for the sons of empire, not the sons and daughters of Black people and former slave, is a punitive position. So that's the introduction or the foreground of this presentation. That's how we locate the university, right? So I would like to discuss what is a
there's a bit of a pause. Hello, guys. I think we just lost Kudzai. We'll just give him a few minutes to link back in. Sorry about this.
Apologies for that. I don't know what happened to my network. Can you remind me, Rachel, where I was?
All right. Sorry. I was busy bothering with this.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're just telling us about your personal experience in this.
Okay. Okay. I believe then I was at the point where I was also sharing the pyramid of hate.
Yes.
Okay. Let me just try and share the pyramid of hate. Show windows. We are having load shedding in Joburg, and I know across South Africa, so network is just all over the place. Can we all see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. Yeah, as I was saying, then the pyramid of hate can give us sort of a good understanding of the way that language sort of plays a role in the sustenance of ways of discrimination, and you see that at the top of or at the upper levels of the pyramid, which if you think about the pyramid, it's held by the base, and the base is usually the widest part of the pyramid. So people that are sort of at the top level of the pyramid happen to be sort of fewer, and there's also sort of more influence at the top, but you also find sort of more aggressive forms of hate taking place there. But if you talk about the pyramid from the base level, that's where I'm sort of trying to focus on. So if people then on the lower levels treat something as being acceptable at the bottom of the pyramid, if here where people, a lot of people are treat a certain behavior as acceptable, then the behaviors at the next level become even more accepted as well. So it's about how things start at the base and they move to the top. And then at the two parts of the pyramid, at the base, at this part, which are where you find your biased attitudes and acts of bias, that's where you find your name calling, that's where you find your belittling jokes, right? So that's where we're trying to focus at. Based on some of the personal experiences that I share in that paper as well. So we can refer, for example, to how, or think about how in the Rwandan genocide, language was used to sort of kickstart a level of hate and naming. So you witnessed in the Rwandan genocide how the Hutus referred to the Tutsis as Inyenzi, which is a native language for cockroaches, to justify the plunder of the Tutsi. So then by virtue of naming, we can then sort of begin a process of dehumanization. So we can also think about how in South Africa xenophobia is used to objectify women, and in xenophobic context, people such as myself, who are originally from Zimbabwe, would be referred to as kwere, meaning that the naming or the language that has been used about myself is a form of, has been used as a way to justify my dehumanization. And we can also think about how in daily consumption of food, the fact that we can also be able to kill animals for consumption involves dehumanization, because by animating or animalizing others, we can then claim that it is justified for us to actually have dehumanized them for consumption. And then in this fact of queerness and in the event of queerness and gender, we think about how women are called all these derogatory names, and how we have other homophobic slurs that are used against people who identify as such. So we can also talk about how ignorance functions to sustain privilege. And Stein also has an important paper around, which is termed the ignorance contract, where ignorance itself is not enough to justify the fact why we do not act, or ignorance has strategic value. So as a man, I can then say, in the midst of an incident that can be sort of harmful towards a woman, or if I witness any form of violence, I can say, I'm not aware, or I did not witness that. And then that becomes a form of sort of justifying my positionality. So I need to go a bit faster here. I think I'll be done in the next 10 minutes. I need to go into the paper which was shared to give an account of what I witnessed, or how I witnessed forms of how language was used in my university life. And here I'm taking account of the Zimbabwean University. And I'm going to read. Out of nowhere, he cracks a joke in class. Joke is about our lecturer, Matambo's sexual prowess. He hails from a clan whose totem is Sokomukanya, which is a monkey, an animal which is fondly known in Shona as Makwiramiti. And Kukwira means to climb on top of a tree. And trees themselves, Miti in the Makwiramiti talks about trees. During the lecture, as several other male lecturers pass through the lecture room to access their offices, one greets him saying, Maswera say Makwiramiti, which means, how are you, Makwiramiti? And then this scene plays out as an endorsement of the lecturer who's saying, I'm Makwiramiti, the totemic hailing. This is Makwiramiti's identity that is being endorsed. Then Matambo goes further and speaks of how he's not only good, and this is where it takes a turn, right? The language, where he's not only good at climbing at the top of trees, like the monkey, but also he translates that to how he's also good sexually. And then he alludes to the fact that he's not only sort of good at penetrating knowledge from a sexual sort of standing, but also how he's good at penetrating knowledge. So also then the language which sexualizes academic performances and tasks becomes transparent. And this is an account of something I witnessed in class as a student and sort of didn't say anything about, which is complicity. And I just want you to know that the name of the lecturers I use here are pseudonyms. So here is an example of why male toxicity goes unpunished in universities when it comes through with language. And this could also be because in neoliberal discourses, there's emphasis on individualism. So one can say the lecturer's conduct is just their character. For as long as they don't kill or touch anyone, it's okay, right? So you see that this is an act that is at the base of the pyramid, which is not sort of part of, cannot be classified as genocide, but actually contributes to wider rape and harassment that takes place in the university, because such language eventually becomes physical. While it might sound innocent, particularly to the complicit male students, we can also then see or think about how such language also leads to eventual genocide. And in South Africa, for example, we can talk about an ongoing genocide of through homophobia and through gender-based violence, and such genocide it can actually be referred to as a slow genocide. So we don't only experience genocide at the top of the pyramid when a woman is killed, but we also can talk about the process towards genocide, and also how these attitudes intersect when that happens. So for example, pardon the example, but if a woman is beating up his wife, they're most probably going to use name calling, insensitive remarks, talk about this economic discrimination, talk about how they're economically above that person, and also include other acts such as rape. So these are connected, but they start somewhere. And that's where it starts is exactly where we are sort of interested in looking. And then the other part of the example I'm going to give is now in a South African university. And this is an incident that happened in one South African university. The only difference is I read this in a newspaper. So there was a male professor who was accused of using an inappropriate sexual example in class. The lecturer equated the length of an academic literature review to a woman's skirt that should be short enough to attract attention, but long enough to cover the subject matter. After that, the lecturer was accused of breaching reasonable professional boundaries through evidence brought forward by a female student that this lecturer was also sort of commenting about her beauty. And amongst male lecturers, the commenting of beauty, personal remarks is sort of normalized. But then the problem with this case is that the lecturer was eventually found guilty, but reinstated. And this shows why it is hard to eradicate sexual harassment in higher education institutions. Innocent as these comments of beauty may appear, or even this joke, they objectify women. One of the prolific scholars in gender, Pumla Kola, speaks about how part of the violent gender power is in celebrating attributes associated with the masculine and ordering the world in terms of binaries. So then the male lecturer assumes a form of hegemonic masculinity that enables him to use the female body as an example of anything, with little to no consequences from the institution. So now the lecturer's institutional authority is disguised as scholarly authority. And such authority is phallic and heteropatriarchal. The lecturer also uses a woman's body as a sexualized example of how to write a literary review. So such language is rapey because it certainly implies that women should be attractive enough to men, but still behave within accepted social norms. So such jokes are systemic, structural, and then they're meant to control the behavior of women and other gender non-conforming people. Because to have such a language dominant in a space would actually, by implication, legitimate that the only acceptable form of being sexual in this space is heterosexual. Because also you would look at sort of the silence on any forms of queer relationships by some of these lecturers. They sort of really normalize heterosexuality. And also there's that emphasis in the issue of race that comes out in these instances that is also very disturbing, that Black women bodies are also hypersexualized to authorize and justify this institutionalized rape of women. So I argue that by language or by force, women are systemically and structurally raped in such lecture rooms. So then rape, when rape takes place, then it is not a moment where we say, or if a victim can say, I was raped on a particular date. But then just like the genocide and what I explained earlier about the pyramid, that can also be termed a form of gradual rape, where the moment of rape sort of comes before, the moment of rape actually comes before the act. So I would like to conclude here so we can open room for discussion, because I know that this is not sort of a one-way street. We also have to have a conversation on this. So where does critical diversity literacy come in? And there's not enough time to sort of go through all of it, but I'm just going to try. Critical diversity literacy, as I alluded to earlier, speaks about how we can be able to read a social situation or power dynamics in an instance the same way that one can read a text, right? So it is important through CDL to recognize power dynamics at play in such institutions as ours. CDL, as I mentioned, is a form of literacy. Literacy and language are important components in this presentation, because I've shown how language is used to objectify, violate, and epistemically erase female and gender bodies, and female and queer bodies. It is only just that I raised the issue of literacy as a possible way out of current systems of thinking. By language in this presentation, if you've noticed, I'm not only referring to verbal and written cues of the day-to-day. I'm also speaking about multiple forms of being in the world, ways of seeing, ways of being seen, ways of occupying space, ways of walking, ways of talking, ways of communication and being that transcend the normal languages of our day-to-day. For example, we can talk about how oppression is written onto certain bodies, such as women, gays, trans people, lesbians, and bisexual. So oppression as a language can be written on particular bodies, such that when the male gaze comes into the scene, or the heteronormative gaze comes into the scene, your body as a woman is read as an object or as a site of violence. So having oppression written on your body means that you're read as a marginal body, and those in positions of power, such as cis, heterosexual, white, or black men, may maintain this reading. If one is read as marginal, their body also becomes a language of domination and exploitation. So the body becomes, therefore, in these scenarios, a text, and not to sort of objectify the body, but to also just state how the body is read prior to also its so the administration of violence. But why is CIDOL important then? Because it's also a literacy and an emancipatory literacy. Because illiteracy has disabling outcomes. To be literate in this way about the various ways that language works in domination allows us not to see externally what is happening in space that is oppressive, but also internally. For example, in my case, what is it that I'm doing wrong? How does my positionality implicate me in the position of these particular marginalized people? And it means that we constantly take a step back to interrogate ourselves so that we can reflect on how we're implicated in these forms of violence that take place. So I think at this point, because I see that we have around 25 minutes left, it can only be fair of me to leave it here, and then we can engage further. Thank you, Chief. I think we can open it up.
All right. Oh, we actually have about 25 minutes. We have 1 hour, so you don't have to hurry yourself. Do we have any questions from the viewers? Do you want to know anything? Is there anything that was not clear, or do you want to add on? I'll just give a minute to see if anyone raises their hand.
So there are no sort of reflections.
I can see, I think, oh, there is Miss Mashidi, so sure, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kudzai, for your presentation. Close speaking here. I just wanted to ask with regards to, if we're looking at eradicating this not eradicating, but reducing or removing this kind of language from university spaces, you've described how systemic the nature of the commentary and the ways of being amongst the lecturing space may be. Is it, what is an approach of removing that kind of language without necessarily making it an individual's problem? Because much of what you've described comes across as being systemic and structural. So, how do you hold the system responsible and achieve systemic change without necessarily, if I can say, making individuals the center of that particular conversation? Not sure if I'm making sense. The idea just being, how can we change the space and its structure without necessarily trying to remove people from those structures and those spaces?
I think that's an important question. That's an important question, and I think one of the ways that we can think of, and obviously one part of the reason why I'm here is not to sort of provide answers, but to also engage with these challenges that we all come across. But I think one of the things that I think I look at in that particular in this particular work is that I ask myself at the end, say, if people like this lecturer who I'm referring to as Matambo in this paper, right? If people like Matambo had sort of gone through not necessarily just CDL, but any form of sensitization around these issues, how would their thinking be, right? Would they sort of still maintain this use of inappropriate examples or or jokes in class. And then I also extend it further to say they might actually have this understanding or even have this sensitization, but still not necessarily implement. And then by extension, I also think about how in actual movements that sort of are freedom movements, such as the Fees Must Fall, you also had male leaders that were using very misogynist language, were also being sort of exclusive towards other sort of non-masculine presenting bodies in general. And I think because this question is, your question is really centered around the structure, then the solutions to that should most definitely still be structural. And the challenge of having the solutions be structural is that without an acknowledgement of any sort of community of practice, or without any acknowledgement of kinds of advocacy work that is taking place within the university that bears evidence to the fact that this is an important kind of work, then it becomes hard for it to be sort of taken up. And I guess that's the challenge of this kind of work, because it's sort of like an entanglement between the structural and the individual, where even if you put this in the public domain, if someone is not necessarily willing to take it up, how do you engage them? How do you push beyond that? Do you sort of put incentives in place for people that are willing to take up that kind of work? Or do you sort of, like you say, do you sort of chase people out that have breached certain ways of conduct when it comes to teaching? So it is for me sort of like you say, it's a very sort of a tension between structure and individuals. How do we hold individuals to account? How do we ask individuals to perform and subscribe in this kind of thinking that is sort of critically diverse, accommodative, tolerant, and also sort of sensitive and conscious of the other. But the problem there is that then the structure itself is not necessarily innocent, right? Because the structure, and that's why we spoke about the university as being colonial, that the coloniality of the university is not only limited to the university being a place that is where the fees are expensive, because Fees Must Fall, for example, was not a protest against expensive fees, but it was a protest against the structure, which then is held in place through a particular form of culture, particular form of capitalism, a particular form of consumerism that is inherently straight, masculine, and things like that. So the answer to that, or my response to that, would then be we need to look at to take a deeper look at the structure. We need to acknowledge that our problems are not, like you say, a problem of Kudzai coming to work and being this toxically masculine individual, but there's also a structure that supports it. There's also a popular culture that supports it. And mind you, this does not sort of end once someone leaves the university. Does not end like in the university. Once you leave the campus in itself, then you enter all of these sort of points of pleasure, like nightlife. If I'm speaking from a Joburg perspective, you find that these things continue from campus and outside campus. And also, how do we deal with this, with the what some refer to evidence of internalization, or how do we deal with the fact that when victims, because Pumla in the book Rape talks about how, like I said there, that rape is not a moment, but she also talks about how in any sort of paid or incentivized form of sexual labor is rape, right? So, for example, how does one talk about lecturers in positions of authority that sleep with students for marks, right? But then you still have students coming to lecturers with that kind of behavior for marks. So it's not sort of like an easy way out, so to speak. And I think the problem is structural. The problem is socialization. The problem might seem like it's individuals, but the problem is collective as well. So yeah, so I think that's an important question. And even as the conclusion of this particular work, I actually stated that this is not an attempt to give any sort of prescriptive ways of thinking or solutions, but this was sort of like really limited to my individual account and my individual experiences. And to be honest, it actually does not end by knowing. So I constantly still have to remind myself of my toxicity now and again, right? So it also doesn't end to say, Chloe is now doing this kind of work, Chloe is now conscious, Chloe is now literate, and now his sort of patriarchal ways of thinking are over. You know, it's never over. It's like my prof likes to put it, and it's obviously not the universal way of thinking of it, but it's kind of missionary work. It's
yeah, and
ongoing work. So which is why it's a difficult thing to map.
No, thank you, Kudzai, for the response. And I understand that it was taking you significantly outside the scope of your work. It was just a question that arose while listening to the work you presented. And thank you for putting that information out there and doing the research to get that info out there so we're aware and can then start finding ways to mitigate, reduce, and change those aspects of ourselves and society. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, so.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Sorry, I just quickly judged it. All right, we have got Shenyu in Flovo. You can ask.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much, Kudzai, for such a a well thought presentation that is also thought provoking at the same time. So I'm sorry, I'm going to try to be short. I'm sorry if I get cut. I'm load shedding this side of the town, and the internet is highly unstable. I would like to pick up the conversation from the question of the structure in terms of how do different structures facilitate these uncalled for languages that are in themselves very problematic. And here I'm thinking about the recent incident of Adam Habib and the SOAS University students. And I'm thinking about all the lecturers who have been charged from one university for sexual harassment, and then we have others moving on to get employed at other universities, but while others continue to struggle with unemployment and having that label lingering on their careers. And looking at the question of the power dynamics and in terms of who affords to do what and who doesn't afford to do what. And if we're asking if even institutions of learning, even spaces that are prepared to take up the transformation agenda, and still thinking about the people who are in positions of power who do facilitate these forms of discrimination, who don't care even about the use of languages and who do everything to defend the image of the institution at the expense of quote unquote minority groups who feel that they're excluded and all of that. So here I'm thinking in terms of how much more activism do we need to put in place in terms of pushing, because every time there is a push, there is pushing from the activists, there is always a pushback from those who hold the positions of power. And then thinking really if universities, in what ways can they carry the agenda of transformation? Can they be spaces of safety? Because sometimes students are just told that, no, you can always leave this university if you feel like you are unfairly treated. And because they are the council members, the alumni who are fundraising for the university and bringing lots of money to the university, and then thinking about how do we even begin to imagine social justice in such spaces. So this is not a question, it's just a puzzle that I'm throwing out there to everyone in terms of how do we think about transformation in such spaces. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's an important input, Khenyo, and I think, yeah, that's part of the reasons why it's also then difficult to talk about these issues, and I acknowledge we really need to talk about them, because also drawing from what you are saying, I also want to say that, like you say, how do you then get out of such a situation when the people that you sort of look up to be implementing the transformation are not sort of proactive towards doing it? And also the other thing there is also the issue of transformation itself. We know that transformation, there's a lot of sort of tokenism that takes place. So when we talk about the inclusion of women and feminine presenting people in the institution, there's also that risk of tokenism where we can actually be told that the fact that we've included 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 number of women in these spaces, then that actually sort of equates to transformation or to sort of gender sensitivity, right? But then, as we know, things such as decolonization, things such as transformation, these are not moments. These are not sort of events where we can say that today we're going to have a full day workshop, and after this workshop, we're going to launch this particular institution, and after launching it, we're going to put these particular bodies, and then they're visible, and then we have transformed. The issue is highly structural. The issue is highly systemic. And that becomes the problem. And I was talking to this when I in my master's class this week with my students, when I was talking about this common question of how do you dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, right? How do you use the very same heteropatriarchal language, the very same heteropatriarchal institutions to create change? Should we actually be looking for questions there? I mean, for answers there, like you rightly point out, Khenyo, to say, is the university actually built for this kind of work? And I think that's a very important question.
Definitely. Thank you, Kudzai, for that. We have Jamie Martin. You can ask.
Hi, thank you. And thanks, Kudzai, for such an interesting presentation. It's always great to hear you talk about your work, and I just really appreciate also how you bring in your own experience and positionality, and I think that's a very important part of the research that you do. My question is because also you frame this presentation around language. I'm just interested, because and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I heard you say kind of using rape as a metaphor. So talking about the structural, sexism and violence that women and femmes experience on a daily basis, as this kind of like ongoing rape, or this, and kind of using, like, in the one hand, I guess I understand the intention behind that, and it is violence and it is rape. But also I'm just thinking and wondering, like, what also function or what impact does that have when we also, use rape as a metaphor? Do we lose specificity when we're talking about, particular types of violence? And I think it relates to what you were saying about how, like, it's like the pyramid, it builds on top. And it is related, and it's part of a rape culture. And yeah, these are just kind of like my initial questions and thoughts. So I don't know if I'm settled on my own understanding around this. but I'm interested if you did that with intention and with purpose, and if so, what that was, and just kind of your thoughts around that, and yeah, use rape as a metaphor to describe other types of violence as well.
Thanks, Jamie, for that. And I think it's an important input there. And I guess my use of the term rape is actually sort of which is why I said at the beginning of the presentation, I would have loved to have, and I think there is a sizable number of male participants or men, that it's, from my personal perspective, it is helpful for me to think about rape in that way, particularly because it allows one to have a heightened sense of how violent each part of this pyramid is. So for me, it is really kind of a way to sort of undo the language of the privilege, to say when one is held to account for a particular moment of violence, then they sort of refer to it as an isolated moment of violence, which is the legal term, right? Which is the legal term, where legally speaking, you would like to have jargon that says, okay, rape is rape. Rape is quantified or qualified through these forms of contact. But this as being the language of the privilege, to say, or the language of the instigator, the language of the perpetrator, I feel for me, it is a way of putting a warning to say that as a man, you need to be aware that by name calling or by doing such and such, you actually are engaging in a moment of violence that can end up in rape, or that can actually be understood as rapey, which is why I made use of the term rapey. So if something is rapey, it is not necessarily the actual contact that is the legal form, but it's rapey because you are sort of it's a very negative term, but it's also a very masculine term, sort of marinating for I call it consumption. You're sort of you don't necessarily start by killing. You start off by showing intent, by imprisoning, by torturing. So that is actually very useful in this presentation as the language of the perpetrator, the language of the privileged cisgendered men. So maybe the better term there would be rapey, which says that joke was rapey, because what that joke shows is that it shows what this person does behind closed doors. So it also draws the line between private and public sphere performances, where in public sphere, one cannot confess that they're a rapist, but by use of their rapey language, through that form of literacy to read into rapey language, we can be able to tell that, but this person, if given the opportunity, or this person behind closed doors, or if there's a case against this person, I would not deny it because this rape did not start at that moment. Remember the language or the jokes he was putting across, that was rapey. So I think as a language of the oppressor, that could be to some extent useful.
Thanks, Kudzai. No, that's very interesting and has given me even more to think about. Thank you.
And thanks for that input, Jamie.
All right, I'm just checking if there's anyone else, but I do not see any reactions. All right, just from my side, and thank you for such a profound talk. And I feel like this is not a conversation we should just have as a once-off. This is an ongoing conversation where we have to work together to see to it how language is being used to discriminate. But okay, there's someone who has their mic on. Sorry, just 1 second. Let me just mute them. All right, sorry about that. So basically, I work in the transformation office, and our office is basically there to ensure that there's transformation in the university. And then we do this by also equality awareness talks, just like the one we had. And we are looking for ways to do this. And I don't know how your university does things, but we would like to partner or collaborate in whatever you feel we could do, so that we could try by all means to minimize this discrimination that happens when language is used in higher education. Also, yeah, so please tell me of any events, any activities that you guys have that we can partner with you, and then we can see how we can involve ourselves in. Yeah, and then I also saw that your supervisor is here. Thank you so much, Melissa, for coming and joining us too. It's good. It shows that we are doing something. If people in that high regard are here for our talks, we are doing something. So yeah, but then I had Dr. William who had I don't know if your mic was open because you had a question or contribution, or you were just, I don't know, I'll just wait for him to see if he wanted to say something.
No, I think it was just a flash. I'm listening. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. So thank you, Kudzai, for
yeah, and I just wanted to say something quickly,
yeah.
Rachel, that we also have a week of day, like a monthly webinar that we host. We can have a conversation outside the space on how we can collaborate. And we also have projects that we're doing at VIDS with the Transformation Office. So we can always converse from here and see how we can collaborate.
Please link me to them. We need to work on this as soon as possible, and to ensure that awareness is spread in education. And I really like this pyramid of hate for you. I have never seen it so greatly represented. And I love the fact that you just did not end off with gender or sexual orientation, but you went on to nationality as well, which is something we have to look at and to pay attention to, because these things are happening. So yeah. So I don't know if you have any last contributions before we call it a day. From my side, I'm done.
No, I have nothing except thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you to your space. Just keep it going, and all the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'll be looking forward to that contact. Thank you so much, guys, for attending. We're going to have more conversations with regard to this topic. And this is not the only time you're going to see Kudzai. We are going to have him again, because we need to keep on talking about this and to see that we are creating change in the spaces that we learn and that we teach and all those things. So thank you so much. It's a minute after our allocated time, but thank you for sticking to time, and thank you. Have a good afternoon further.
Cool. Bye, everyone.